Jackson stood up, heart pounding, and shouted at the judge. "You don't know who my father is. You don't know what my mom's been through." The room went silent, his father seething with rage. What happened next would shock everyone, especially Jackson. This moment would change everything. But let's start from the beginning. Jackson Green, a 14-year-old boy, stands frozen in the courtroom, his back straight but his heart racing. His eyes flicker from the judge to his father, and then to his mother, Maria, sitting beside him. She's been holding it together all this time, but Jackson can see the exhaustion on her face, the weight of the years in every line. The tension in the air is thick, almost suffocating. The crowd surrounding them seems distant, yet their whispers claw at his ears, reminding him that this isn't just about him anymore. It's a battle for his future, for his family. Across the room, his father sits with an expression of cold calculation. John Green, a wealthy businessman with a polished demeanor, looks like someone who's used to getting what he wants. His suit is perfectly pressed, his hands folded neatly in front of him, but his eyes betray an unyielding hunger. He's not just fighting for custody, he's fighting for control. The way he talks about Maria, dismissing her as incapable of providing a stable home, fills Jackson with a simmering rage he can barely contain. It's as though his father is erasing everything good about her, everything she's fought for, and replacing it with the same cold, calculating logic he uses to win deals. Jackson feels the anger bubbling up, but he forces it down. He has to stay focused. This isn't just about anger. This is about survival. His whole life, his future, is on the line. His father has already presented his case. Maria can't hold down a job, she's unstable, and she's an inadequate mother. But Jackson knows the truth. He knows the long nights his mom spent working hard to make ends meet, the way she always put him first, even when it meant sacrificing everything she had. She's been his rock, and he's not going to let anyone tear her down. Not without a fight. Judge Anderson, a woman who carries the weight of years of experience on her shoulders, sits at the bench. Her expression is unreadable, a mask of indifference as she listens to the arguments from both sides. She's heard it all before, Jackson can tell. The way her eyes scan the room, how she jots down notes with a practiced hand. It's like she's already made up her mind. She's heard this kind of case 100 times. To her, it's just another day in court, just another family dispute. But Jackson isn't just another case, and Maria isn't just another mother. Jackson knows he has to make her see that. As the final statements are made, the room falls silent. The weight of the moment hangs heavy in the air, and Jackson feels the pressure building. His chest tightens, his palms are clammy, and his throat is dry, but he won't back down. He can't. He feels the pull of the world's eyes on him, the judgment in their stares. He's just a kid, barely a teenager, and yet his future rests in the hands of a judge who has no idea what it's like to fight for something that matters. He knows what he has to do, but the words feel like they're stuck in his throat. Then, without warning, Jackson stands up. His legs shake as if he's about to collapse, but he forces himself to straighten, to meet the judge's gaze. His mother looks at him, surprise and worry flashing in her eyes, but Jackson gives her a small nod. This is it. This is his moment. He's not going to sit back and let his father control everything. Not anymore. "I don't want to live with him," Jackson says, his voice trembling but louder than he expected. The words echo in the quiet room, ringing through the air like a declaration of war. He can't take back what he's just said, but somehow it doesn't matter. His heart is racing, but there's something freeing in those words. For once, he's speaking his truth. He's telling the court what he really feels. His father looks at him with a mix of surprise and anger, and Jackson knows that he's just crossed a line. This isn't something his father expected. Jackson wasn't supposed to be the one to make a stand. He wasn't supposed to be the one to challenge the system, to expose the lies. The judge, too, seems taken aback. Her pen freezes mid-air, and she looks at him with a mixture of skepticism and confusion. It's as if she's been expecting a carefully prepared argument, a rehearsed statement, not this raw burst of emotion. Her eyes narrow slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Jackson's gaze meets hers, and for the first time, he wonders if she truly understands what he's trying to say. Does she know what it's like to feel like you're drowning in a world that doesn't care? Does she understand the weight of everything he's fighting for? He doubts it. There's a long pause. For a moment, Jackson thinks that maybe he's done the wrong thing. Maybe he should have stayed quiet, let the adults handle it. But then he remembers his mother's face, her tired eyes that still shine with love for him despite everything. He remembers the way she's fought for him his entire life, never giving up even when the world seemed to be working against them. And in that moment, Jackson feels a surge of something more powerful than fear. It's a quiet but undeniable resolve. This is his fight, and he won't let anyone take it from him. The judge clears her throat, as though trying to shake off the surprise of Jackson's outburst. She looks at him for a long moment, but her face gives nothing away. Her voice is cold, professional as she asks, "Are you sure about this, Jackson? Do you fully understand the consequences of your words?" Jackson swallows hard, but his answer is unwavering. "Yes," he says, his voice steadier than before. He knows there's no going back now. The battle has just begun, but he's ready to fight. The courtroom, once so suffocating, feels a little more alive now. Whatever happens next, Jackson knows he's done something no one thought he could. He's made his stand. The tension in the courtroom has shifted. Jackson watches as his father, John Green, speaks with chilling precision, each word calculated to tear down everything Jackson holds dear. The man is no longer his father in Jackson's eyes. He's a stranger, a figure cloaked in wealth and power, using every tool at his disposal to make sure Jackson's world crumbles. John's voice is smooth, authoritative, as he addresses the judge, weaving a story of Maria's supposed failures. "She can't even hold down a job," John says, his voice dripping with disdain. "How can she possibly raise a child when she can't even care for herself?" The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. He can feel them land deep in his chest, like someone has reached inside and grabbed hold of his heart. His father's words are poison, each one cutting deeper than the last. Jackson's hands tighten into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he struggles to control the storm rising inside him. Every lie, every fabricated piece of evidence his father presents is like salt on an open wound. He can see it all. The careful way John plays the game, manipulating the truth to his advantage, painting Maria as unworthy, unfit to care for her own son. The cruel irony doesn't escape Jackson. John, who abandoned him for years, who left Maria to raise him alone, is now trying to rip him from her care, to use his money and influence to erase everything she's done for him. Jackson's eyes flicker to his mother, sitting next to him, her face drawn and weary. He sees the quiet hurt in her eyes, the way she tries so hard to hold it together, even as the walls close in around her. Maria isn't perfect, Jackson knows that. But she's always been there for him, always tried her best, even when the world seemed determined to break them. He remembers the sleepless nights she spent working 2 jobs, the way she sacrificed her own needs to make sure he had what he needed. He knows what his father says is a lie, but it doesn't stop the weight of it from pressing on him. The courtroom is a blur around him. The legal jargon floats through the air, words he doesn't understand, and phrases that seem to blur together. His eyes never leave his father's face, though. John's self-assured smile, the smug way he looks around the room, as if everything is already decided. Jackson's blood boils with the injustice of it all. He can feel the hate building inside him, a dark knot that tightens with every passing second. He can't stand to hear his father's voice, can't stand the way he talks about Maria like she's nothing. Like all the sacrifices she made don't mean a damn thing. His father's words continue to echo in his ears. She's unreliable, unstable. She has no ability to provide a stable home for him. The words twist and turn in Jackson's mind, making him feel sick. He wants to stand up, scream at his father, tell him everything, how he abandoned them, how he never cared. But he doesn't. Instead, he sits there, silently fuming, as the judge listens intently. The look on Judge Anderson's face makes Jackson's stomach churn. She seems so composed, so detached, as if his entire life is just another case to her. The way she nods, scribbling notes, her eyes glancing occasionally at Jackson, tells him everything he needs to know. She's listening to his father. She's considering the possibility that his father might be right. Jackson knows that if the judge believes this version of the story, his whole life will be turned upside down. He'll be forced to live with a man who he hasn't been able to trust for years, a man who sees him as nothing more than a pawn in his game. Jackson's heart races in his chest, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. The idea of leaving Maria, leaving the only real family he's ever known, fills him with an icy dread. What kind of life would he have with his father? Would it be any different than it was before? No, he can't imagine it. His hands start to shake, but he clenches his fists tighter, refusing to show any weakness. He won't let this happen. He won't let his father take away everything Maria has fought for. But even as he tries to muster the strength to speak, he feels a sinking feeling in his gut. It's hard to ignore the growing sense of inevitability, the way the judge seems to be leaning toward agreeing with his father. He's losing control of the situation, and the thought of it makes his stomach twist in knots. There's a moment, just a brief one, when Jackson wonders if it's all already over. The weight of his father's words feels like a suffocating blanket, and he can feel the walls closing in around him. He turns to Maria, her hand trembling slightly as it rests on the table. She's trying so hard to hold it together for him, but he can see the cracks forming in her facade. For a second, he's not sure if he can do this, but then he feels a surge of something else, something deeper, something stronger than his fear. It's anger. Anger at his father, anger at the unfairness of it all. John's voice cuts through his thoughts again. This is about what's best for Jackson. I'm offering him stability, security. I can give him everything he needs. The words are so hollow, so devoid of meaning. Jackson knows what his father really wants: control, power, and everything that comes with it. But Jackson isn't his property. He isn't a possession to be won or lost in a courtroom. And he's not going to let his father take everything from him without a fight. His father looks at him now, and Jackson meets his gaze, his jaw set in a hard line. This man, this stranger, does not get to decide his future. Not today. Not ever. Jackson doesn't know how he's going to do it, but he knows one thing for sure. He won't let his father win. The judge looks back and forth between Jackson and his father. The weight of the moment settles heavily on Jackson's shoulders. His father's smug expression fades slightly, and Jackson can see the cracks forming there too. The doubt that begins to flicker in his eyes gives Jackson a brief glimmer of hope. It's a tiny thing, barely perceptible, but it's enough to make him hold on a little longer. The battle isn't over yet. The courtroom had been tense, each argument building toward a heavy silence that seemed to hang in the air. Jackson could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. But then, as if everything that had been building in the last few hours was about to break, Jackson's father, John Green, stood up with a smug smile, holding up a piece of evidence that would change everything, a video. He turned it on, and a grainy image flickered onto the screen. It was of Maria, Jackson's mother, at a school event, her voice raised in frustration, her face contorted with anger. She had lost her temper, the heat of the moment spilling over, and the video captured every moment of it. Jackson's stomach dropped. It wasn't the whole truth, just a small piece of a much larger picture. But John knew exactly what he was doing. He knew this one moment would be enough to tear apart Maria's defense, enough to sway Judge Anderson into thinking she was unstable, that she was unfit. Jackson's breath caught in his throat as he watched the footage. He could hear his father's voice behind him, narrating the scene. This is the type of behavior she's been hiding from everyone. How could she be trusted to care for a child in a stable home when she can't even control her emotions? The words stung, each one a sharp reminder of how his father had always seen her, not as a person, not as his mother, but as a failure. The room buzzed with murmurs. Jackson could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the anger and frustration rising up like a tidal wave that threatened to drown him. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the effort to hold it all back. His father stood there, smug, leaning against the table like he'd already won. He'd presented his evidence. He'd painted Maria as a broken, unstable woman, and it was working. The judge, who had remained mostly neutral up until this point, scribbled something down on her notepad, her eyes glued to the video. Jackson's stomach twisted. He could already feel the shift in the room, the weight of the evidence, the collective judgment of everyone present. His father's influence had already seeped into the air. Maria was being painted as weak, unable to handle the responsibility of raising her son. Jackson's pulse quickened, and the anger, now boiling inside him, refused to be contained any longer. For the first time in his life, he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him, but his resolve hardening with every step. His mother's hand shot out to grab his wrist, but Jackson gently pulled away, his eyes locked on his father. The room fell silent. All eyes were on him. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts, his body trembling with a force he couldn't control. "You don't know my mom!" Jackson yelled, his voice cracking but strong. The words shot out of him like a weapon, years of pent-up frustration, anger and helplessness pouring out in a single moment. "You don't know what she's been through!" The silence that followed was deafening. The room felt like it had stopped breathing, every person caught in that one defiant moment. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a thundering reminder that this was it. He had no backup. His father had all the power, all the influence, but Jackson couldn't keep silent anymore. His words echoed against the walls, the bitterness, the pain, and the truth in them reverberating throughout the room. His father was just a man. A powerful, wealthy man, yes, but just a man who had abandoned his family and now used that same power to destroy them. And Jackson was done letting it happen. The judge paused, her pen hovering midair as she looked up at him, her face unreadable. Her eyes flicked to Maria, then back to Jackson. But it didn't matter. Jackson could see the skepticism in her gaze. She was taking this all in, his outburst, the raw emotion. But in that instant, he didn't care if she believed him. This was his truth. It was the truth of every tear his mother had ever shed, of every sacrifice she had made. The judge raised her hand, a gesture to silence the room, and the whispers and gasps slowly faded into nothing. But Jackson wasn't done. His voice had found its way through the barrier of fear, and now it wasn't stopping. "You think you know what's best for me?" he continued, his voice sharper now, more focused. His words didn't stumble or falter. They cut through the air with the precision of a blade. "You think you can decide my future in a single afternoon? He was speaking directly to Judge Anderson now, his eyes burning with the truth that had been building in him for years. This wasn't just about his mother. This was about who he was, what he was willing to fight for. His father couldn't take this from him. His mother had fought too hard. She had given up everything for him, and Jackson would not stand by and let her be destroyed. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression still cold and calculating, but Jackson could see the faintest shift. Her hand hovered above her notepad, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. He wasn't sure if she was moved, but for the first time in this whole ordeal, Jackson felt like his voice mattered. The anger, the rage that had been brewing inside him for years finally had a place to go. It had a direction. It wasn't about tearing down his father anymore. It was about standing up for his mother and for himself. His voice broke through the silence again. "I'm not some prize for you to win or lose," Jackson said, his voice steadying as he spoke. "I'm not a choice to be made based on who has the most money or who can tell the best lies." Jackson could feel the weight of the room, the eyes still on him, but for once he didn't care. He was done hiding, done cowering beneath the power his father held over them. This wasn't just his battle. It was his mother's, his future's, and his. And Jackson was ready to fight. His father's face darkened, but Jackson didn't look at him. His gaze remained locked on the judge, a quiet defiance burning in his eyes. This moment, this explosion of emotion, would not be taken from him. His father had his lies, but Jackson had his truth. And now, for the first time, he was making sure everyone heard it. Jackson's words echoed in the silence that followed his outburst, and the tension in the courtroom thickened. For a brief moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The judge, still poised, her pen hovering over her notes, his father's cold eyes staring back at him, and the room holding its breath, waiting for the next move. But then the unexpected happened. The whispers which had been bubbling just beneath the surface erupted into full-fledged murmurs. Eyes shifted from Jackson to his father, from his father to the judge, and the very atmosphere of the room began to change. The public, who had been content to sit quietly as spectators in this private battle, could no longer ignore the tension crackling in the air. It wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was something bigger, something that demanded attention. As Jackson's words reverberated around the courtroom, cameras shifted into focus, capturing every raw, unfiltered moment. The reporters in the back of the room had been quietly observing, taking notes for their stories, but now their pens moved frantically, capturing the shift in the tide. The courtroom had become a spectacle, something to be consumed by the public. Jackson's outburst, his challenge to the judge, had turned this private matter into a public event, and the media wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. Jackson could feel the eyes of the world on him. He wasn't just a boy fighting for his mother's right to keep him. He had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up against injustice, no matter how powerful the adversary. It felt like the weight of the entire room had shifted in that moment. His chest still heaved with adrenaline, his pulse still quick, but now it wasn't just anger burning inside him. It was something else, something stronger. Hope. And then, as if the universe had decided to answer his call for justice, the first voice of truth rose from the shadows. A former nanny, someone who had been a quiet observer of the family's inner workings, stepped forward. She had been silent until now, but the media frenzy, the sudden shift in public opinion, had stirred something inside her. She cleared her throat, her voice shaking slightly as she began to speak, but the gravity of her words carried an undeniable weight. "I've worked for the Green family for years," the woman said, her eyes scanning the room. "I've seen things that never made it to the public eye, things that weren't in the press releases. things that Jackson's father has always hidden. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. The nanny's testimony was a thunderclap in a room that had been so quiet it seemed to reverberate through the walls. Jackson had never known exactly what the nanny had seen behind closed doors, but he'd always suspected that his father's public image was a carefully crafted illusion. Now it was beginning to unravel. The woman continued, her voice growing more confident as she spoke. John Green was never the father he pretended to be. He was manipulative, controlling. He used fear to keep people quiet. I saw him lash out at Jackson, at Maria, more times than I can count. There were bruises that never made it to the police reports. And Jackson, he wasn't just a child in that house. He was a tool, a prize to be won. The room was silent, every person hanging on her every word. Jackson's father, for the first time, shifted in his seat. His usual calm demeanor cracked. His jaw clenched tightly, but there was no denying the truth that was now out in the open. The cracks had started to appear, and they weren't stopping anytime soon. Jackson's pulse quickened. His father's perfect, polished world was falling apart. The lies, the manipulation, the control, everything that Jackson had known deep down to be true but couldn't quite prove, was finally coming to light. His father's carefully constructed facade was shattering before his eyes, and Jackson could feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. The former nanny's testimony was just the beginning. As the hours ticked on, more witnesses began to step forward, people who had been afraid to speak out until now. A neighbor spoke about the times she had seen John Green's temper flare, the way he would storm out of the house after arguments with Maria. A close friend of Maria's came forward, describing the emotional toll the constant pressure had taken on her. Each word, each piece of truth that was revealed, chipped away at the control Jackson's father had so expertly maintained. The courtroom, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt different. It was electric with the weight of the truth. The judge, who had seemed so composed and confident at the beginning of the trial, was now visibly shaken. Her hands, which had been steady earlier, were now slightly trembling as she wrote notes, processing the information being presented to her. The confident, almost detached demeanor she had shown so far was starting to crack. She was listening. She was paying attention. Jackson felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for a long time. Hope. The anger that had burned so fiercely inside him was still there, but now it was something more. It was a fire fueled by the belief that justice could actually be done, that the truth, however painful it might be, could win out in the end. He glanced at his father, sitting there, his face flushed with anger, but there was no hiding the unease that had started to creep in. John Green had always been a master at maintaining control, but now, the control was slipping from his grasp. The lies were being exposed, piece by piece, and Jackson was watching it all happen in real time. Judge Anderson's gaze flicked back and forth between the witnesses, her expression unreadable. But Jackson saw it. The subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders had relaxed slightly. She wasn't as sure as she had been. The certainty she had shown when his father had presented his evidence was gone. The tide was turning. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Jackson allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he and Maria could win this battle. The truth was on their side. And with each new revelation, it was becoming clearer that John Green's world of manipulation and deceit was finally coming undone. Jackson's anger burned brighter now, but it wasn't just rage. It was the fire of someone who had seen the truth rise from the ashes of lies. And it felt like the beginning of something new. Something that could change everything. Judge Anderson sat at the bench, her fingers trembling slightly as she looked over her notes. The usual calm composure she carried with her had shattered in the wake of the testimonies that had unfolded before her. The once steady hand, scribbling facts and legalities with practiced precision, now hesitated over every word she wrote. The courtroom, which had once felt like a controlled space, now seemed to pulse with an energy of uncertainty. The truth, so carefully concealed by Jackson's father, had come to light, and the judge, for the first time in this case, seemed unsure. Jackson could see it clearly. Her brow was furrowed, her gaze flicking between the witnesses, his father, and Maria. The small crack in her professional demeanor was enough to send a ripple of hope through Jackson. But with that hope came fear. Fear that despite everything, despite the overwhelming tide of truth that had come crashing down on his father, she might still rule in his favor. Jackson's chest tightened as he glanced at his father, who was sitting with that smug, composed expression. His father was always in control, always the man with the plan, the power, and Jackson knew that power stretched far beyond the courtroom. John Green had the means to buy influence, to manipulate people into believing whatever he wanted them to believe. Could the judge really ignore the force of that power? Could she stand up against someone who had everything to lose and nothing to fear? The doubt crept in, slowly, like a dark cloud rolling across the sky. Jackson clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms as he tried to steady his breath. The case had seemed so clear before, so simple. Jackson and his mother, against a man who had spent years manipulating the system, presenting himself as a father figure to the world. But now, with the weight of public opinion, the media frenzy, and the potential for the judge to still favor his father, Jackson felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had fought so hard to expose the truth, to prove that his father wasn't the man he pretended to be. He had stood up in court, shouted his truth, and seen witness after witness step forward to expose the lies. But what if it wasn't enough? What if, despite everything, his father's wealth and influence would still be enough to turn the tide in his favor? What if all of this, the years of pain, the struggle, the fight for justice, was for nothing? For a brief moment, Jackson felt as though the floor had been pulled out from under him. The weight of the uncertainty pressed down on him like a physical force, and the fear of losing everything, the one thing that had kept him going, was almost too much to bear. Was this all just a fool's hope? Was his belief in the system and the truth truly enough to overcome the power his father held? But then, as Jackson's eyes darted around the room, he caught sight of his mother. Maria sat next to him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face streaked with tears that had been held back for so long. Despite the raw pain in her eyes, there was something else there, something stronger, deeper than the despair that threatened to overtake them. It was determination. It was the same fierce will that had driven her to work 2 jobs, to fight for her family every single day. Her gaze met his, and in that moment, Jackson saw everything he needed to see. The doubt that had clouded his mind began to lift, slowly, as if her quiet strength was pulling him out of the darkness. Maria had never given up. She had never stopped fighting, even when it seemed like the world was stacked against her. And now, in the face of everything his father had done, she was still standing tall. She was still there, still holding on. Jackson's heart steadied, and his fear, though still present, began to shift. He had come so far. He had fought so hard. And he wouldn't stop now, not when his mother was depending on him, not when her strength had carried him this far. The weight of his family's future was heavy, but it wasn't just on his shoulders. It was on hers, too. And if she could keep going, if she could fight with everything she had, then so could he. Jackson drew in a deep breath, and the overwhelming fear that had almost drowned him started to recede. He wasn't done yet. He wasn't about to give up. The fight wasn't over. He couldn't let his mother down now. She had given him everything. He could give her this. The truth, the fight, everything he had. It was all worth it. It was worth standing up, worth risking everything to prove that the truth would prevail. The uncertainty still lingered in the room, thick and palpable, but Jackson could feel a shift in himself. The judge's hesitation, the weight of the decision, the power his father still seemed to hold. It didn't matter as much as it had just moments before. Jackson knew what he had to do, and he would keep fighting for as long as it took. He turned his gaze back to Judge Anderson. She was still quiet, still staring down at her notes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But Jackson's resolve had solidified. She might be uncertain, but he wasn't. He would stand by his mother's side, no matter what the outcome. He had already come too far to turn back now, and as long as there was breath in his lungs, he wouldn't stop fighting. The judge finally looked up, her eyes meeting Jackson's for a moment. There was no telling what would happen next. But in that instant, Jackson knew that whatever the outcome, he had given everything. He had fought, and he had made his stand. And for that, he could hold his head high. The gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling a brief recess. Jackson's heart didn't stop racing, even as the noise of shuffling papers and muttering lawyers filled the space. His hands were still trembling, despite his best efforts to steady them. He stood by his mother, his mind reeling from the testimonies that had just rocked the courtroom. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Had it been enough? Had all of their efforts truly made an impact? His father still sat across the room, seemingly composed, but Jackson could feel the tension in the air. His father's power, his resources had always seemed insurmountable. Now, for the first time, there was a sliver of doubt in Jackson's mind. Was it possible they could actually win this? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. Jackson turned, and his eyes widened as the court clerk, a quiet figure who had been lurking at the back of the room, walked forward. She held something in her hands, an ordinary file, but in that moment, it felt like the answer to a prayer. The clerk's steps were deliberate, her movements calm despite the chaotic atmosphere swirling around the courtroom. As she neared the judge's bench, all eyes turned to her. Jackson's pulse quickened. A strange mix of fear and hope swirled in his chest as he wondered what was inside that file. The judge had barely acknowledged the clerk, but now all attention was focused on her as she handed over the file, her eyes briefly meeting Jackson's before returning to the judge. Judge Anderson took the file with a slight frown. Her fingers skimmed over the front, the room quiet now, the air charged with anticipation. Jackson's mother, Maria, stood next to him, her face pale and tired. But there was a flicker of something else there, something Jackson hadn't seen in her for a while. Hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to end in defeat. The judge didn't speak at first. She opened the file slowly, her brow furrowing as she began to read. The room was so still it felt like time itself had frozen. Jackson's mind raced. What could be inside that file? The evidence that had been presented against his mother had seemed damning. His father's wealth, his connections, had they been enough to sway the judge? And yet, here was something new, something unexpected. The seconds stretched into minutes as the judge's eyes scanned the papers. Jackson couldn't breathe. His body was taut with tension, every muscle wound tight as he waited for the judge to speak. His father's face, once so confident, now looked uncertain. For the first time, there was a slight crease between his brows. John Green, the powerful businessman, the man who always seemed to be one step ahead, was now visibly rattled. Judge Anderson raised her head slowly, her expression unreadable. She cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the stillness. "It seems we have some new information." she said, her tone surprisingly neutral, almost detached. She looked back down at the file, flipping through the pages one last time. Jackson felt his stomach lurch. The air in the courtroom felt thicker now, charged with a new energy. The judge's eyes flickered up to meet his father's for a brief moment, and Jackson saw the briefest flicker of something in the judge's gaze. Disbelief. Without missing a beat, Judge Anderson spoke again. "This evidence," she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom, "appears to show that there were discrepancies in the financial documents provided by Mr. Green. Assets were concealed. Some documents have been tampered with." The words hit Jackson like a slap to the face. His father, who had always been so careful with his public image, so meticulous in hiding his darker side, had made a fatal mistake. Jackson's mind struggled to process what he was hearing. His father, the man who had always portrayed himself as a successful and stable businessman, had lied. He had manipulated his own finances to make himself appear more credible, more reliable. The judge's voice continued, but Jackson could barely hear the words over the pounding of his own heart. "Mr. Green," Judge Anderson's voice now rang with a much sharper tone, "it seems that your case, which appeared to be straightforward, is now called into question. We will need to take immediate action to reassess this evidence." A wave of disbelief swept through the courtroom. Murmurs erupted, loud whispers of shock and confusion. Jackson barely registered them. All he could focus on was the heavy weight lifting from his chest, the sudden rush of air that seemed to fill his lungs. This wasn't just a small crack in his father's case. This was a devastating blow, a revelation that could change everything. His father's face flushed with anger. For a moment, he looked like the powerful man Jackson had always known, a man who would manipulate the truth and destroy anyone who stood in his way. But then, for just a fraction of a second, that facade wavered. His father's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could regain control. He opened his mouth, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. For the first time, Jackson saw his father at a loss for words. The judge, sensing the shift in power, stood up from the bench. "We will adjourn for a short time," she declared, her voice firm. "The new evidence will require immediate consideration. A decision will be made after a full review of the facts." The room was in uproar. Lawyers scrambled, reporters clicked their pens furiously, and the tension in the air was electric. But Jackson barely noticed any of it. His heart was racing, the adrenaline flooding his system. He was still standing, still rooted to the spot, but everything around him felt like it was moving in slow motion. The court clerk, who had set this all in motion, was already backing away from the judge's bench, her expression unreadable. Jackson caught her eye for just a moment, and in that fleeting glance, he saw something he hadn't expected, a quiet nod of approval. And then, the realization hit him. This wasn't just a small victory. This was a turning point. The truth had been exposed. His father's lies, his manipulations, had finally been uncovered. Jackson's pulse quickened even further, but this time, it was with something more than fear. It was with the first flickers of victory. This wasn't just a fight for custody anymore. This was a fight for everything he believed in, for the truth to triumph over deceit, for his mother, for their future. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jackson was no longer afraid. For the first time, it felt like the weight of everything was finally tipping in their favor. The courtroom was utterly still. The air felt thick, charged with the weight of the moment. Every eye was fixed on Judge Anderson as she sat at the bench, her hands clasped tightly around the file that had just revealed everything. The room was a silent ocean of waiting breaths, each person waiting for her to make the inevitable call. Jackson's pulse hammered in his chest, each beat a reminder that this was the moment he had fought for. This was the moment that could change everything. Judge Anderson's face was unreadable. She flipped slowly through the papers in front of her, her eyes scanning the new evidence that had been presented, evidence that had torn through the illusion his father had so carefully constructed. The secrets, the lies about his finances, the hidden assets meant to paint him as more stable than he was. Jackson could feel the weight of it all in his gut. The courtroom, once filled with tension and uncertainty, was now heavy with the gravity of truth. Jackson could barely breathe. His hands were clammy, his mind spinning. His father, sitting a few feet away, was not the composed man he had been earlier. He was visibly rattled, his jaw clenched tight, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Jackson had never seen his father like this. Cornered. His power and influence no longer enough to protect him. The cool, collected businessman that had once seemed untouchable now looked like a man who had been exposed, a man who had no way of maintaining control over his carefully constructed empire. His eyes, cold and furious, locked onto Jackson with pure contempt. Jackson felt the heat of his gaze, but it didn't matter anymore. The battle wasn't his father's to win. Not now. For the first time in a long time, Jackson wasn't afraid. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a mixture of anticipation and certainty. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his mother. It was about standing up for everything they had been through. All the years of struggle, the late nights when Maria had done everything in her power to provide for him, to make sure he had a future. The love, the sacrifice, the fight. They were all wrapped up in this single moment. As Judge Anderson continued reading, Jackson felt his body tense. He wasn't sure what was taking so long. Maybe the weight of the decision was too much for her. Maybe the case had become more complicated than anyone had anticipated. But whatever the reason, he didn't care anymore. He had already said everything he needed to say. He had fought with every ounce of his being. And now, it was in her hands. The truth was laid bare before her, and there was no way she could ignore it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Anderson looked up. Her gaze swept over the room, and for a brief moment, it rested on Jackson. Her eyes were sharp, as though she could see right through him, to the very core of his being. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what she was going to say. The anticipation, the fear, the uncertainty, it all built to a deafening crescendo in his chest. After careful consideration, Judge Anderson's voice rang through the room, calm and steady, yet carrying an authority that made every word feel heavy. I have reached a decision. Jackson's heart stopped for a moment. The words hung in the air, suspended in time, as if the very fate of everything he cared about rested on the next few seconds. He could hardly breathe. His mind raced through every possibility. Could she really rule against him? Could his father's wealth, his influence, his manipulation of the system still win out in the end? The judge continued, her words falling like a hammer. I have decided that Maria Green will be granted primary custody of Jackson Green. His father, John Green, will have limited visitation rights. The world shifted. Jackson felt the floor beneath him steady, like the ground he had been fighting on was finally firm. The weight of his father's oppressive presence, his power, his manipulation, it all seemed to lift in that moment. Jackson's heart exploded with relief. He hadn't realized how tightly he had been holding his breath until he felt it rush out of him in a long, shuddering exhale. The tension that had been choking him for so long finally broke. It was over. He had won. The words echoed in his mind as he turned to his mother. She was looking at him, her face pale, her eyes wide, and then, slowly, a smile began to spread across her face. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough. It was the smile of someone who had fought, who had endured, who had made it through to the other side. Maria reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on his arm. In that touch, Jackson could feel everything they had been through, everything they had lost, and everything they had gained in this moment. His father, across the room, was a different man now. His face had gone ashen, his features stiff with shock and disbelief. Jackson could feel the satisfaction rising in him, but it wasn't the satisfaction of seeing his father's defeat. It was the satisfaction of knowing that his mother's love, her strength, and their fight had won. The system, with all its flaws, had finally been forced to see the truth. And the truth had won. Jackson turned back to the judge, who had already started writing down her final remarks. His father's fury was palpable, his fists clenched, his knuckles white. But Jackson didn't care. He had nothing to fear anymore. The truth was out. And now they had their victory. He could hear the whispers rising in the room, some in disbelief, some in admiration, but none of it mattered. This moment wasn't about the court, or the people watching, or the media. This moment was about him and his mother. This was the beginning of a new chapter. They had fought for it, and they had won. Jackson's heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of pride and relief. He had done it. He had stood up for what was right. And in doing so, he had secured not just his future, but his mother's too. The nightmare was finally over. It was a moment of victory, but it wasn't just about the court ruling. It was about everything that had led to this point. The truth, the fight, and the love they had for each other. For the first time, Jackson knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The gavel fell with a sharp crack, and in that instant the world seemed to pause. For a heartbeat, everything was still, quiet. Then, as though the air itself had been waiting for this moment, the courtroom erupted. Applause filled the space, a collective sound of relief and triumph, breaking through the tension that had held everyone captive for so long. Jackson stood frozen for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. The noise, the overwhelming sense of victory was almost too much to process. But the truth of it was undeniable. He had won. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was something deeper, something far more profound. This was a battle for everything Jackson and his mother had endured, for every tear, every sleepless night, every moment they had fought to keep their family together. And now, after everything, after all the fear and doubt, the world had finally seen what they had known all along. The truth had prevailed. His family was whole again. Jackson turned slowly to look at his mother. Maria's eyes were shining with unshed tears, her lips trembling with emotion. She was standing beside him, but for a moment it felt like they were the only two people in the room. The applause continued, but to Jackson it felt distant, muffled, like everything else had fallen away. It was just him and his mother, standing in the aftermath of a battle they had fought together, side by side. Without thinking, Jackson stepped toward her, his arms reaching out. When he pulled her into a tight embrace, he could feel the weight of the past few weeks, the months, the years, melting away. Maria's arms wrapped around him, her body shaking with emotion. But it wasn't just the exhaustion of the battle. It was the release of everything they had both been holding in. The pain, the fear, the constant worry that had haunted them both. It was all gone now. For the first time in so long, they could breathe. "I knew you could do it," Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew you'd fight for us." Jackson didn't know what to say. Words felt small in comparison to what he was feeling. But as he held his mother, the reality of what they had accomplished began to settle over him. This battle had changed them both. It wasn't just about winning in a courtroom. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about refusing to let the lies and the cruelty of his father win. About holding on to the love and strength they shared, no matter how hard it got. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the applause began to fade. The warmth in the room had changed too. The cold, unyielding walls of the courtroom, walls that had once seemed so imposing, now felt different. The sterile air, the legal jargon, the sense of power and control that had hung in the room, all of it had shifted. What was left was a space filled with something else. Respect. For Jackson. For his mother. For their fight. Jackson looked up, and his gaze met Judge Anderson's. The woman who had once seemed so detached, so far removed from the raw emotions of the case, was looking at him now with something new in her eyes. There was no longer the stern, impassive expression that had dominated throughout the trial. Instead, her gaze was softer, almost thoughtful, as if she had seen something in Jackson that she hadn't anticipated. Something that transcended the law, something that spoke to the core of what it meant to fight for justice. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Jackson saw it. Respect. And perhaps, even more than that, a newfound understanding. He had fought not just for himself, but for something bigger, something she, in her years of experience, had witnessed countless times, but perhaps never quite in this way. This wasn't about the legalities or the rules of the courtroom. It was about standing up for the people you loved. It was about making sure that love, in its purest form, could never be overruled by power or wealth. Jackson felt a surge of something deep inside him, gratitude, pride, and, above all, satisfaction. He had done it. They had done it. It wasn't just the legal victory that mattered. It was the fact that they had fought for their family, for what was right, and they had won. The truth had been laid bare, and in the end, it had been enough. As the judge stood and gathered her papers, Jackson could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive weight of fear and uncertainty anymore. It was the weight of triumph, of justice. The warmth in the room was palpable now, as if the very walls themselves had breathed a sigh of relief. Jackson and Maria stood there for a moment longer, just holding each other, savoring the rare quiet that came after the storm. When they finally pulled apart, Jackson looked at his mother, her face streaked with tears but also radiating something else. Peace. "I'm proud of you, Jackson," she said, her voice steady now but with a depth that made Jackson's heart swell. Jackson didn't have the words to respond. He could only nod, his heart too full to speak. But he knew that what mattered most in that moment wasn't the applause or the victory. It was the fact that they had stood together. They had fought together. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, they were free. As they walked out of the courtroom, Jackson's heart swelled with satisfaction. He had stood up for what was right, for love, for justice. And in the end, he had seen it triumph. The battle wasn't just a legal one. It was a battle for everything he believed in. And it had been worth every second. Justice, in its purest form, had prevailed. And for Jackson, that was all that mattered.